Howdy, everyone. Good to see you. Thank you for having us here. Thank you, Omina. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Manna. Unfortunately, there are too many people out there who have no clue as to what an appraisal is and how important it is in the home buying process. And so we're going to talk about certain aspects of the appraisal process, what appraisers are. We're going to have 5 different topics. What is an appraisal? Who is an appraiser? How does an appraiser determine value? What is the appraisal report all about? And what should I look for, and what do I do if I think the appraisal is not accurate? Everybody wants the dream of home ownership. And so the buyer wants to buy, the seller wants to sell, the lender wants to lend. Everybody wants the deal to go through. The appraiser sort of acts as the gatekeeper because we are not involved. We are independent, we are impartial, we are objective. And we want to do the best job for you and also for the lender, because the lender is putting out the vast majority of the money to purchase that property, and we don't want you to overpay for that property. We want you to pay a fair and equitable amount for that property. And sometimes the stars get in your eyes and you're like, I just have to have this home. And we don't want those stars to be in your eyes. We want to take the pressure off of you so that you make a reasonable decision. As we indicated earlier, we are both real estate appraisers. We are both serving on the Board of Trustees of the Appraisal Foundation. And many of you would ask, what is the Appraisal Foundation? And the Appraisal Foundation is basically a standards-setting organization. We are recognized and authorized by Congress to set those standards for all of the appraisers across the entire country. And those appraisers are producing appraisals for not only real estate, but personal property and business valuation. But we're going to concentrate tonight on real property or real estate, the ability to value a home or a commercial piece of property, any type of property. So the first topic we're going to talk about is, what is an appraisal? And an appraisal is a very simple thing. It is one man or one woman's opinion as to what the value of a property is. Now, that's the easy part. The hard part is figuring out what that value is and all the steps that an individual must go through in order to develop that opinion of value. You make a decision, you go out into the public, you go out, you look for a home, and you ultimately make a decision as to which home you wish to buy. And then you start the negotiating process with the seller. And they want a certain amount of money, you want to pay a certain amount of money. Usually you want to pay a lot less than what they want to get for that property. And you negotiate and you finally arrive at a sale price. The appraiser then comes in, analyzes that sale price, analyzes all the conditions surrounding that sale price, analyzes the market, analyzes what we will call comparable sales, which are those property that they will compare to your subject property in order to determine if that is a reasonable and appropriate price to pay for that dwelling. And so as it says, an appraisal on that third slide that you have there, an opinion of a property's market value performed by a professional, licensed, or certified appraiser. What a typical buyer would pay. Now, in that little sentence there, it talks about a professional, licensed, or certified appraiser. If you are getting a loan from a federally insured depository institution, which is essentially a bank, or someone who sells loans to banks, it is mandated that this appraisal be performed by a licensed or certified appraiser, meaning not just anybody can go out and do that appraisal. An individual must go through a process, have certain educational requirements, take certain courses, have years of experience, and then ultimately take either a 3 or a 6-hour test in order to be licensed or certified. We have to be confident in our opinion, and we have to be firm in our opinion, and we have to be justified in our opinion. How do we do that? Research, analysis, and we'll talk about those steps in a minute. Why do you need an appraisal? It's for protection. It protects the bank, on the amount of money that they're going to lend, and it protects you, as we said earlier, because we don't want anyone to pay too much for a property. When the stars get in your eyes and you think, this is it, this is the property for me, sometimes good judgment goes out the window. And you don't want the good judgment going out the window. And if it does, then it falls on our shoulders to say, look, this is why it's worth what it is. And hopefully everybody's the wiser for that. Why do you need the appraisal? Well, the lender is going to mandate that you have an appraisal. After all, in most cases, who's putting more money into the deal, you or the lender? By a wide margin, unless you have several $100,000 just sitting in your pocket that you can go out and pay cash. The lender wants to be protected for the amount that they are, in fact, investing in the form of a mortgage. And you also want to be protected from the amount of money you're depositing, your down payment, whatever that is. If it's $100, if it's $1,000, if it's $10,000, if it's $20,000, nobody wants to just wash that money away. So, you need it from the bank's standpoint, you need it from your standpoint. Who orders the appraisal? Well, sometimes the bank orders it. Sometimes these entities called AMCs, or appraisal management companies, will order it. And the AMC is working as an agent for the lender. And they're going to order the appraisal, and then the appraisal is going to go back to them, and they're going to review it and then send it back to the bank. Are all opinions appraisals? Well, again, as we said, they're prepared by state licensed and certified appraisers. Their work must fully comply, and there's a new term for you, Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, or USPAP. The Appraisal Foundation has a board called the Appraisal Standards Board, and the Standards Board creates uniform standards. That means every appraisal is performed according to these standards across the entire country, and every appraiser who's a licensed or certified appraiser must adhere or stick to those standards, so that, again, everybody is on a level playing field. There are other types of valuation instruments out there. As it says, alternate valuations. There are computer-aided valuations called AVMs, or automated valuation models. Brokers will do price opinions when they're trying to price a home as to how much it should be put on the market for. And then also something called a CMA, or a comparable market analysis. Again, prepared by real estate agents to determine an asking price. Those are not appraisals. You may see them, they may show up, but they are not appraisals performed by a licensed or certified appraiser. Sir, you have a question.
I do have a question. Now, when talking about the business of being an appraiser, one of the things that you mentioned was impartiality.
Correct.
Which would, in my opinion, have a degree of honesty involved. Now, what if that impartiality gets corrupted? Now, granted, you said there are guidelines, there's rules, but I'm certain that there are cases when it has indeed been corrupted.
You're a very astute young man. Yes. It has been corrupted. Yes, it has. And that's why we have licensing and certification. And later on, we're going to talk about different segments of an appraisal. If you think an appraisal is not correct or it's inaccurate, the different alternatives that you have. But let's say this, every licensed and certified appraiser is licensed or certified by a particular state. And if an individual does something incorrectly or does something wrong, they are subject to loss of license. They are subject to all kinds of sanctions, fines, in some cases, jail time. So it's taken very, very, very seriously, and if something is done improperly, there are extreme ramifications and repercussions.
Yes, what are valuations?
Actually, something that you do every day. Putting a monetary number on how much you think it's worth. That's what a valuation is. Now, there are several ways we can do that, but basically, that's all it is.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Okay, I'm getting ready to purchase, I have a contract on a condominium in Washington, D.C. through MANA. And in keeping with the fraudulent things that you're weeding out, since I know someone that is an appraiser, I probably couldn't use that person, right? Since they have to be impartial.
Impartiality can be maintained under any circumstance. It could be your sister doing the appraisal, your brother doing the appraisal. They can still maintain impartiality. But when it is a federally insured depository institution and a federally regulated transaction, there cannot even be the appearance
That's right.
of a problem.
That's right.
So the answer is no in that particular situation. But I could have an interest in a property and still appraise it as long as I made complete and full disclosure.
Okay, thank you.
Did we have another question down here, sir?
Do you give your customer like documentation, letting them know what the worth of the property is so they can sort of like, I guess, do the research on their own to see how you came up with the amount of the home?
As far as the documentation go, it's mandated that you get a copy of the appraisal before you close the deal. If I'm understanding you correctly, you want to get a ballpark. Like I'm saying that this house is worth $100,000. You just don't really want to trust me. You want to be able to cross-check it with something else.
Exactly. Okay. Right.
A lot of ways to do that. You know, you can look on the internet and go to some of the free websites. So that's the way I would advise you to do from a consumer standpoint. One of the things that the purpose of this is to educate the consumer. One of the best ways to combat against fraud is have the people who are using the service to be knowledgeable. That's part of the reason why we're here.
So once again, you do give out documentation, right?
Let's just clarify that. We don't give out
We don't, no.
documentation because, as I said earlier, our client is the bank,
Right.
not you. So even if you called us up, we can't talk to you. But as Lawrence said, you are entitled to a copy of the appraisal a minimum of 72 hours prior to the closing. So that will give you ample time to review it,
Okay.
and we're going to talk later about that process.
So how important is the comps to the appraisal?
How important are the comps to the appraisal?
Yeah, like, you know, you have a lot of new
Yes.
homes in
Comps,
historically poor areas.
for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, is short for comparable sales. And that's one of the approaches that we will talk about. But they're critical.
Right.
If you don't have a good comparable sales selection, if the appraiser does not do a good job in the selection of comparables, the likelihood of that appraisal being accurate goes way, way down. So it's critical that the appraiser be competent and understands the market, understands the various neighborhoods, and understands the characteristics of the property so that they can make an appropriate and proper comparable sales selection.
Well, what is an appropriate, like, mile radius? Like, I know it has to be within the neighborhood, but
Again, my two favorite words in all of appraising are "it depends."
okay.
So it's not a specific area
Right.
because there may be the exact same neighborhood 2 miles away,
Right.
and in between, nothing is similar.
Right.
But yes, if you can keep it in your neighborhood of sales, similar properties that sold recently within the neighborhood, that's obviously the best.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we don't always get that
Right.
because we can't make up the sales. It's what happens in the marketplace.
And keep in mind that it's going to vary by location. If you are in the city, you may have a fairly defined area, but in some of the rural areas, things are a lot more spread out. So it depends. The key is the property that you're comparing it to something, I'm thinking as a buyer now, is this something that you would compare it to? In other words, would you buy this property if you couldn't buy the one that you're trying to get?
We've been doing this for a long, long time, and we've met a lot of other appraisers. And when we talk about appraisers and doing appraisals, we have friends out west, and their closest comparable sale might be 400 or 500 miles away. because they're appraising ranches.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they may go to another state.
Right.
So it's great if you can stay here, but you have to go where the data is.
Most basic question, what's the difference with an appraisal and the price of the property?
An appraisal is an opinion. The price is a fact. See, if I tell you, I got this property, I'm going to sell it for $100,000. That's the price. That's fact. Now, ABC Appraisal Company sends somebody out there and they're going to give their opinion. Okay? Sometimes they line up and sometimes they don't. The appraisal has to be supported by facts. In other words, comparable sales, recent comparable sales, to develop that opinion. An appraisal is an opinion of the value of that particular thing.
And I think, as Lawrence indicated, many times the appraised value and the purchase price are the same. Because if a willing buyer and a willing seller are both putting that negotiation together, and other willing buyers and other willing sellers are selling properties, then the comparable sales should justify the purchase price. And many, 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 many times it does. But there are those situations where, for one reason or another, maybe the seller is not fully informed, maybe the buyer is not fully informed. You know, if you don't know an area, you go into an area and it's like, oh, I'm going to buy the first house I find. Or the seller is under pressure to sell because they're getting behind in their payments, so they drop the price. I mean, in certain situations, an appraiser will come in and appraise the property for more than what it's selling for. And they will also appraise it for less than what it's selling for. Let's take a break. We're going to cut now and get ready for the next section. But as I said, we're going to have questions, a question and answer section at the end.
One thing I want you to understand, and this cannot be overemphasized, that the appraiser can't have a dog in the fight. He has to be objective, independent. He also has to be competent. Okay? So these are the concepts. The person that comes out that performs this service for you has to be independent, has to be impartial, and has to be objective, and he cannot be an advocate. Appraisers have three categories. Licensed appraisers. These appraisers who can appraise properties, single-family properties up to four-family properties, four-unit properties, up to $1 million. Okay, that's a licensed appraiser. A certified appraiser is an appraiser who can appraise any single-family up to four-family property with no limit on the top number of value.
And that would be the certified residential.
Yeah, certified
appraisal.
residential appraisal. Thank you, Steve. You have the final category is the certified general appraisal. And that particular appraiser can appraise any property. Commercial, residential. It has no limitations, and he has to be has the experience and competency in these various areas, but as far as the licensing is concerned, he can appraise any real estate. Who writes the appraisers? requirements. We talked earlier about the Appraisal Foundation. There are two boards that handles two separate parts of the appraisal industry. We have a standards board that sets the standards that the appraisers have to perform by. Then we have the qualifications board, which sets the qualifications for the appraisers. Each state may have stricter requirements. However, most of the regulatory agencies adopt USPAP in their state regulations and their laws. Even though the standards that are put out by the Appraisal Foundation, they don't carry the force of law. But once they are adopted by the various states, that's when the regulation and penalties and all the sanctions come in for violating the standards. When an appraiser comes out to inspect the property, he's not going to be like a home inspector, because his concern is mainly in the value of the property. You have to get professionals that have particular expertise in the details of the plumbing inspector or electrical wire inspector or roof inspector, termite inspector. But appraisers are required to report what they see. Touching some of the pillars and the wood is real soft might be an indication that some kind of wood destroying insects might be involved. Now, am I a professional? No, but I have to point that out. Things that are readily observable, any competent appraiser will see. And that's the standard that we hold all appraisers to. You know, you can't ignore things. Things that the average homeowner might see. Well, it should show up in the appraisal report. How does an appraiser form an opinion of value? One thing you have to understand, you hear the term, well, appraisers set the value. Well, appraisers don't set the value. The market, and when I say the market, I'm thinking things that are happening in the market. Buyers and sellers make an offer on a property, and the seller accepts it, becomes a transaction, close the deal, that becomes a comparable for something else. That's what determines what the value, what's going on in the market. And the buyers really kind of determine it. Because say, for instance, you got a situation where there's not a whole bunch of properties out there available for you, but it's got a lot of buyers. Everybody trying to get it. What happens? Price goes up. Okay. But in a situation where you got a whole lot of property, and well, maybe banks not lending money at this time, or folks don't have money right now, and they still have to sell that property, what happens? Go down, okay?
That's the time to buy.
So we don't set the value. We collect the data, analyze the data, and render an opinion of what the value would be based on the facts that we get from the market. There are two other approaches that we sometimes use, not all the time. We use the income approach, where we determine basically what our property has sold for, and we compare it to the rents that it's generating, and we can come up with a value that way. It's kind of a complicated. We don't really have time to get into that part of it right now. But somebody asked about a new construction, and on new construction, we use the cost approach. And stated briefly, we take what it costs to build it, the cost of the materials and stuff that you put together to make the house in its aggregate, then add the value of that land based on what land is selling for, or sites or lots are selling for, and you come up with a cost approach. Most of the time, that's required when a property is just being built. You'll have the comparables, and then you'll have the cost approach. But cost approach is a little bit more complicated, and you don't run into that as often as you do the sales comparison. See, the reason why the sales comparison is, I like to talk about it because that's something that you can grab onto, and you do it in your daily life anyway. You're always comparing stuff before you pay for it. We talked about using at least 3 comparable sales. The houses that you compare them to should be they should be similar. You know, when you look at these reports, when you get them, you want to compare if they have the same characteristics. You know, you don't want to compare. You want to compare apples to apples. You know, you don't want to have a house that's got all the bells and whistles and stuff, and then the other house is being compared to don't have them, and he's making all these convoluted adjustments that's just trying to make them equal. There should be enough data out there where you can pick up houses that are relatively similar in the same neighborhood, preferably. How much people are paying to move and live in this neighborhood? Now, sometimes that doesn't work. He talked about an instance where you have an older neighborhood and they're building new houses. How do you find comps from that? Well, a lot of times in urban areas, this is not going on just in one place. You may have to go across town where they're doing the same thing in an older neighborhood building new houses. What determines that? The buyers. People are buying houses over there, so that's where your data is coming from. Now, you have a chart, well, a form that's in your packet. And this is just an illustration of what the comparable grid looks like in a report. So when you see this, and we're not going to get into it too deeply, but I want you to pay attention to this and keep this, because when you buy your first time home, and you're going to get a copy of the report at least 72 hours before the deal closes, you'll have something to kind of relate to in terms of what that grid is all about. This is just a format for comparing properties. You know, the principle I spoke of earlier, where if one property has something the other one don't, you have to make an adjustment for it. My property has something that the comparable don't, you have to make an adjustment for it. Well, this is the grid that we use to do all the math on that. Most of the times it's done by appraisal software. Back in the old days, we used to have to do it by pencil, but I want you to understand the concept. And this is where that concept is applied onto this. It's on page 2 in the what they call the Uniform Appraisal. What's this acronym?
URAR,
All right, thank you.
Uniform Residential Appraisal Report.
That's right. Glad you're here. Thank you.
I do the best I can with my limited abilities.
So that basically covers what we want to talk about. Are there any questions that you have? Here it comes.
So my question is, what if an appraisal either appraises for less or more? Does that affect the purchase price?
Again, what are my two favorite words in all of appraising? It depends. And that's absolutely the truth. Mm-hmm. If the property is appraised for less than the sale price may be impacted, because if you can't get the financing, let's use Lawrence's example. It's selling for $100,000 and it only appraises for $90,000. And you're going to put 10% down. So you put $10,000 down, the bank would in theory give you a $90,000 mortgage. If it only appraises for $90,000, you can still put your $10,000 down, but the bank's only going to give you $80,000. So you would then either try and renegotiate and see if you can get a price adjustment, or they may say no deal and you walk away. If it appraises for more, I wouldn't recommend you go to the seller and say, hey, you sold it for me too cheaply and I'd like to pay you more money.
Exactly.
That probably won't happen.
Yeah.
Right. And I just have one more other question. When is the appraisal normally done? Because I heard other people talking about home inspection. So would that be before the home inspection, after the home inspection, or does it even matter?
It's usually a better idea to have it done after the home inspection, because if something turns up that the appraiser wasn't aware of, some internal structural flaw or something like that, you're going to probably have to go back to the bank and go back to the appraiser and say, hey, we found this is a problem. So rather all those problems be disclosed up front, and then the appraiser knows what they're working with.
And in some deals where the lender has already ordered that stuff, well, the appraiser gets a copy of, gets access to that, so that he'll have that information available to him while he's trying to determine what the value is.
Copy of the home inspection.
In some cases.
In some cases.
In some cases. Not in all jurisdictions, but in some cases.
So we're at the bottom of page 6, the appraisal report. We've talked enough about the appraisal report. We talked about a form report, which is the most typical report that report that you're going to see in terms of a lending decision. And the reason these forms were created was to create uniformity so that the lenders get the same report type over and over again, whether it's for a single-family dwelling, a condominium, a 2 to 4 family dwelling. There are different forms for each property type, but they follow the same format. And those 2 examples that Lawrence alluded to earlier, that's the back page or the second page of the URAR form, which is the single-family form that houses the comparable sales selection. So, again, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, I think you're all familiar with those terms. They're the secondary mortgage market, and they are the purchasers of the loans that these banks originate, and they want to see a standardized form and format. So you're familiar with those. The appraisal report, no matter what form it's on, and it might not be on a form. When you do commercial appraisals, they're typically narrative appraisals. They all must conform, again, to uniform standards or to USPAC, done by licensed or certified appraisers. The next slide, the appraisal report accurately described the property. It may require a number of comments. As Lawrence said, you could have a property that has all the bells and whistles. You could go on for pages and pages describing the bathrooms and the kitchens. And you could also go on for pages and pages describing what poor condition that property is in. The roof is at the end of its economic life. How do we know? As Lawrence said, you go up on the second floor and you get rained on. It's got to accurately disclose. It's got to have enough comments in there. It cannot be misleading. Again, it's like a narrative story where you're telling the lender, you're telling the property owner, you're telling the buyer, you're telling the seller what you observed and how you came to the conclusions that you came to. Down at the bottom of page 7, the red flags that might indicate a poorly done appraisal. And again, we've talked about some of those things. Having incomplete data, having inaccurate data. Your comparable sales selection is poor. Either they're vastly different properties, they're not from the same neighborhood, they occurred sometime in the past that's not acceptable. As Lawrence said, you know, the amount of time that a sale has occurred is not so important as to what's gone on in the marketplace since that sale. A sale 6 months ago in a stable market is a perfectly good comparable sale. A sale that took place 2 weeks ago with some major occurrence having taken place in between that time is no longer comparable. So again, what do we look for? Good comparable sales, accurate data, good measurements, good description, good everything done well. If you have inconsistency with adjustments, that's a problem. You know, appraisers must rely on the data that they get from the market. They can't just make statements, they can't make accusations, they can't say, oh, this is a good neighborhood or this is a bad neighborhood without proof. And that is critical. You can't omit things. And again, we talked about the bad appraisers out there. I've seen bad appraisers take photographs of the property and then take a photograph of the street and neglect to mention the burnt-out building next door or the gas station on this side or whatever the case might be, because they're trying to accomplish something they shouldn't be accomplishing. So you've got to be accurate, you've got to be truthful, you can't omit things or put things in. If you think there's a problem with the appraisal, and you can't just again let your emotion take over, oh, they didn't appraise it for what I paid for it, I'm going to get that guy or that gal. You've got to be rational, you've got to be reasonable, you've got to read the report, and if you've done all that and you find a problem, then you certainly point it out to your lender and say, look, the appraiser missed the second bathroom, or they omitted the fact that this is a brand new heating system, or something like that. You've got to have facts to justify your concern. So read the report, look at it carefully, and then go to your lender and say, look, I think there's a problem because of A, B, C, or D. And be prepared to defend it. Again, it can't be an emotional thing. Again, go to your lender, discuss the problem, be prepared to defend it, and then if it's really a serious, serious problem where you've got all kinds of difficulties, you can go to the state. As we said, every state licenses the appraisers. And if you've got a bad problem, go to the state. File a complaint. That's how we weed out the bad apples. There's additional people who you should contact on the next page, the different financial agencies. The next slide talks about the booklet, the brochure that you all have, Why Engage a Professional Appraiser and a Guide to Understanding a Residential Appraisal. That booklet, I think, is going to answer even more questions for you. And at this point, we've got a quick little summary from Sir Lawrence, and then we'll open it up for the final round of questions.
A professionally prepared appraisal is your best protection against overpaying. Think about that. You don't want to, as soon as you sign the contract, you're upside down. Most of you know what I mean when you say upside down? Okay. So your appraisal is your best protection because it's going to be supported by all the things that we've talked about earlier. The appraisal must meet national standards. Whether the value was what you expected or not, it's not really important as to whether or not how it was done and was it done accurately and professionally and without advocacy involved into the report. The appraiser should help you understand what information the appraiser used and how it was used to arrive at the opinions and the conclusions. This is a tool that you use in the process. And I might say, not being biased toward appraisers, but believe me, there's nothing more important than understanding the value of what you're getting ready to buy. Most important aspect of the deal. You guys are going to leave out of here armed with a little bit more tools.
As we did the inspector, when he came to inspect the home we were looking to buy, do you pay the appraiser after the job is done? Or how does that work?
The inspector, you pay separately because the bank does not require a home inspection.
Okay.
That's your decision, and obviously I think a very wise decision to make. The bank, as I think we indicated earlier, engages the appraiser and the bank pays the appraiser. You don't pay the appraiser. What you do is you pay the bank and then the bank pays the appraiser.
Now, if the appraiser does a poor job, do I get that money back or?
That is something that occurs between the lender and the individual.
Okay.
And my guess is if the appraiser did a really bad job, there'd be some accommodation made.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I have two questions. One, is the price standardized across the market for appraising, for the cost of the appraisal? I know you mentioned that it was $350. And two, the banks work with certain appraisals, or is it that or is it that they have like a pool that they can just pull from, or is it that, like for example, TD Bank, do they have like 4 appraising firms that they work with only, or is it that you know, does it rotate? I'm just looking at to see if it is that these banks are working with these certain appraising companies, how much transparency would continue after a certain amount of years.
Okay, so 2 questions. Is the fee standardized? I'll answer that. No. I take the easy questions. It's going to vary depending on the property type. I'm sorry. It's going to vary depending on the property type. You know, a very large home is going to cost more to appraise. A complex home, a condominium is going to be different than a 2 to 4 family. So it's interdependent. And it varies by county, by state, by town, by city. So that's the answer. The simple answer, no, but for a whole variety of reasons. The second question about the pool from which they pull from,
Well,
Lawrence?
We had a recent law passed, the Dodd-Frank law, and what it did was separate the person who's going to, the lender, from the appraiser. And most of the times, lenders and real estate agents and everybody who has a vested interest in the transaction, or there's kind of like a wall in between them and the appraiser now. Most of the time, the lenders will use a appraisal management company. That management company says to Mr. Banker, okay, we don't want you to get involved with the appraiser, because you can easily see how that could be a conflict of interest. So you get somebody in there to handle all the issues that involve the appraisal. Okay. That way the appraiser don't have the issue of Mr. Back in the old days, I'm gonna tell you back to your question earlier, back in the old days when the guy could call you up and said, if you don't come in with this number, appraise this property the right way, you're not gonna get any more appraisal assignments from me. Okay? Putting his hand on the scale, making the numbers come in. Well, that don't happen as much now. Now, we have appraisal independence laws that keeps that kind of stuff from not happening. So, there are some cases in certain communities, smaller communities, where you may still have a panel that's at the bank. But the people who order and process the loan and the people who actually appraise the property, there has to be a firewall in between those two people. Okay? Most of the time, when you said a pool, the banks used to have a panel of appraisals, and they would rotate them and stuff like that. That's not so much now, because of the problems that had, where the officers who were ordering the appraisals were putting pressure on the appraisals, because he was getting paid by commission. So the more loans he closed, the more money he made. Now Joe Blow, honest appraiser, old crazy Netterville, goes out there and tells him what the property really is worth, and he can't close. Well, he won't call me no more. But that's part of the problem we had. But again, we got laws and stuff that separates that. There's a wall between the people who have a vested interest in the property and the transaction and the appraiser.
Well, you have been a terrific audience, excellent questions. Your depth and knowledge is very impressive. Thank you very much.